Welcome back to another episode of Before You Buy, the show where we give you some straight up gameplay and our first impressions of the newest games releasing. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today we're taking a look at Concord, the new 5v5 hero shooter published by Sony and developed by Firewalk Studios, a new studio Sony acquired a few years back to add to their growing stable of live service games. Now, there is a lot of negativity swirling around this one, and everyone is kinda set to call it a failure before it's even out. That said, I'm giving Concord at least a fair shake, trying to evaluate the game on its own merits. I mean, we'll make videos about how bad a game is when there's some big controversy about it, if the game is bad. But the thing is, that's not what this is. This is impressions. It's not a week in and we agree with what's going on. This is early days. And I honestly don't think that it's bad. It needs to be said that that could change. I don't know. But for what I have played, I don't want to call it like a banger or anything, because it's not. It's got a fair amount of things that I don't like, and I will tell you plenty about that in the next few minutes. But let's get into it. So on the surface, Concord looks like something we've all seen before. It's another hero shooter. There are a few things that make it stand out, though. The basics, they look all very familiar. You got 16 free gunners to pick from. They all have their own weapons, primary and secondary abilities, and passive traits. Each match is 5v5. You can pick any one of these guys as long as someone else isn't playing them. And one thing that's interesting about that is that there's no class limit here. It just comes down to what free gunner, the hero, I'm just going to call them heroes, your teammates pick. So there's potential for some pretty bad or extremely good hero synergies, depending on team composition. There are 6 game modes split between 3 playlists. There's the Brawl playlist with Takedown, this game's version of Team Deathmatch, and Trophy Hunt, which is just kill confirmed. Then there's the Overrun playlist, which has area control modes, Signal Chase, which is like hardpoint, and Area Control, which is domination. And then you got the last playlist, which is Rivalry, which has Cargo Run and Clash Point. They're probably the most Overwatch-like modes, but they're oddly locked away behind a hardcore no respawn playlist, which I don't want to call it unforgivable, but it's definitely not what I would expect. Effectively, you're only playing 4 game modes. At least that's the way it is right now, pre-release, because nobody is playing Rivalry. I tried to get into a game multiple times. One time I managed to wait 7 full minutes in a queue before the game just gave up and kicked me out. Not joking. That's a completely serious thing. I couldn't play these modes if I tried right now. Maybe when the game is actually out, this will be more popular, but right now, I cannot play it. So all the currently available game types are pretty generic. It's the sort of thing we've seen many, many times already, but when you're actually playing the game, it does feel like its own unique thing. What surprised me when I started the game up for the first time were health pickups that appear at fixed locations on each map. Rather than almost instantly restoring your health, like in a Call of Duty, or having to entirely rely on your team to keep your health topped off, like Overwatch, this game has more of a hybrid approach, where there are heroes with healing abilities, but you can also restore your health by grabbing these pickups. It gives the game a little bit of an arena shooter vibe, and it makes knowing the maps even more important. It also puts a big emphasis on survivability. If you play your cards right, it can actually be difficult to die in Concord. Time to kill is already pretty slow, and combine that with the many movement powers. Everybody has some kind of dodge ability, and it's possible to go for a long time without getting killed if you know what you're doing. Another interesting change is that a lot of your abilities have limited cooldown, and at a certain point you can't use them unless you take out an enemy. Most support abilities can be used endlessly, but a lot of the abilities that do damage or are particularly powerful force you to kill somebody else before you can use them again, and I like that. It encourages aggressive play. On top of all that, there is the Crew Builder, a feature that lets you build a custom crew to bring into matches, and depending on what characters are included, you can get special crew bonuses that give you little bonuses for the actual matches, like improved healing or longer effective range on your weapons. Picking a certain hero or switching to another one will give you a bonus related to their class. Nothing huge, but it can give you an edge. It seems like something that could be annoyingly metagamey at higher levels, especially if your whole team is swapping between characters just to get bonuses and there's no consistent team formation. But I don't know, it seems like the buffs you get are minor enough that it probably doesn't matter a whole lot. Basically something that might encourage somebody to try multiple characters at lower levels until they find something that outweighs the benefits of those buffs. Or at least I would guess that's what they're going for. And on top of that, there's alternate versions of the heroes to unlock that have different passive buffs which are thankfully not that hard to get, and at least from my experience, they don't feel game-breaking or anything, but it does obviously affect how you're playing with that hero. So there are some unique things going on here. I'm not saying all this stuff has never been done before, but the way Concord combines hero shooter and elements of an arena shooter, I would say is novel. I've never seen a game quite do it like this. I'm not sure it's unique enough, though. There are some general mechanics that give this game its own flavor, but the overall package feels kind of been there, done that. So a lot of the design of this game calls to mind something I've seen in something else, class abilities from Overwatch, movement of a Destiny 2, and the character designs that are a kind of a great value, Guardians of the Galaxy. It's not bad. I will say some of the characters look pretty lame. Not gonna lie about that. Like, look at Starchild, this big muscle alien dude. He's just one of the Blood Brothers from the Guardians game. Practically the same. It's uncanny. Let's actually take a second to talk about the characters. In a hero shooter, you need appealing characters. Characters that look cool and seem like they would be fun to play as. You don't necessarily need good characters, like with deep backstories or something. Just solid, visually interesting characters. And I'm sorry, the current roster isn't doing it for me. I don't hate them. I've seen worse. But a lot of them just don't look great. They're both too simple and too complex in a weirdly off-putting way. Half the roster are just humans in Buzz Lightyear suits. And the cartoon aesthetic is kind of jarring, combined with the hyper-realistic characters. The more alien and robot-looking guys fare better, but honestly, most of the background NPCs in the last Guardians game were interesting and iconic compared to these guys. I'm just not particularly enthusiastic about playing as literally any of the hero characters, so when I'm playing, I'm mostly just focused on their weapons and powers, and that's it. And that just doesn't feel like enough for one of these types of games. As cheesy as it sounds, you gotta have some kind of aesthetic connection to your character to really get into it, and I just don't, which is obviously kind of a problem, because for some reason the developers decided to go for some kind of storytelling angle here. The game starts off with an extended cutscene of these dorks applying to be free gunners. It's boring. The characters don't make a good first impression, and once the first cutscene ends, the game immediately transitions into another cutscene at the same location, but now there's another guy. Don't know where he came from, wasn't there before, don't know what anybody's talking about. I'm hopelessly lost. It's week 0. Oh, what's that? That's what the Galactic Guide is for, huh? One of the biggest options on the main menu, and it's a lore dump. The presentation is solid. I like the galactic map, but while a lot of these planets look interesting, what good is any of this if we barely see any of it in the game? It's hard to really care about lore if you already know going in, and also you already know it's not going to matter. I think the devs want to do these weekly story events to introduce an overarching narrative so that, I don't know, people keep logging in. I don't see the point of these things, or cutscenes in general in purely multiplayer games like this. Even my beloved finals can kind of annoy me with whatever the hell it's telling me with their cutscenes. But at least they keep it to a minimum. Here in Concord, this is not the case. Maybe if there was some kind of integrated story with the gameplay, but that's not the case. The game just tries to add a little character to things like daily, weekly, and seasonal missions by calling them jobs, acting like the multiplayer games you're playing are some way missions that you're completing, but it's all really thin. I normally wouldn't even comment on something like that. Most multiplayer games are like this. But this game is trying to tell some kind of story, but they don't justify it in any way. It'd probably be better off without it, honestly. The graphics are good, at least. On PlayStation 5, everything runs very well, and the frame rate stays very consistent. I didn't experience much stuttering or a lot of lag when I was in a match. Everything felt good to play. All seemed pretty polished, and the pastel space visuals worked really well on the actual maps. I think previously I said something about really liking the color palette when we were talking about this on an upcoming games list or something. But I will say, it looks nice, but it's not enough to be memorable. Like, to say the color palette is nice is a very generalized statement. You start needing specifics for it to really stick, and you don't really get it. None of these places are really recognizable in any way. They're all just sort of anonymous space locations, except for the one with the big alien corpse at the center. That one sort of stands out, but the rest of the maps just kind of run together. They look good, and there's a decent enough selection, but nothing really stood out as particularly great. It all looks nice, but doesn't leave much of an impression otherwise. So I've gone this long talking about the game, and I'm going to admit to you guys something I feel a lot of shame about. The terrible truth is, I suck at Concord. The vast majority of the games I played here, I lost. I'm not holding that against the game, but I will say it does kind of have a snowballing problem. Most games I played, either the enemy team totally dominated us, or we completely destroyed them. maybe it's just because it's early and people are still learning to play the heroes, but with this game, more than pretty much any other hero shooter I've had some experience with, the quality of your team is going to make or break your experience. The time to kill is high. There's healing everywhere, and depending on your team, there are buffs, debuffs, and traps all over the place. And if your team isn't on the ball supporting each other, then your team is just going to get destroyed. This can lead to some pretty short games. Extremely short. And that can be really disorienting for someone new. The actual tutorials are also subpar. They're not good enough. Even with the ability to read all about a character's ability, when you get them, it can be overwhelming to try to figure out certain heroes in the middle of a game where there's all these effects and special abilities flying around. Generally, any team that blobs together and has a proper support character or two will do pretty well, while a team of lone wolves is always going to get massacred. It's a complex game that requires players to know how 16 different characters behave, but they do almost nothing to set you up for success starting out. So my experience is probably going to be the same for a lot of other players. You're going to get massacred for the first few hours before you start getting the hang of things, and if you're somebody who likes to bounce between multiple characters, that's, gonna suck, kinda. Eventually, I started to see success by focusing on survival over trying to kill everything. If you go into this game with a Call of Duty mindset, you're gonna get cooked. Movement's too slow. There's too many heavies who can tank tons of damage or heal themselves and put up shields. Unless you got 2 or more guys focusing fire on a single dude, a lot of the time you're barely scratching anybody. The lighter characters go down faster, but if they're controlled by someone smart, they know how to back off. Once you start figuring stuff out, the game does get a lot more fun. And I can see there being a niche for a game like this. I was having fun after a pretty miserable first impression, and I slowly started to appreciate what it was bringing to the table for how varied and all over the place a lot of the character powers are. I didn't notice anything as unbalanced and overpowered as the abilities from like X-Defiant. There's no ultimates, which is appreciated. There's no I win button here. It all comes down to teamwork and skill. You're probably going to get slapped around for a while, but once things start to click, it is a fun game. My biggest issue with Concord right now is there's just not a lot here to keep people playing, especially not with so many similar games out there competing for your time. With only 6 game modes that are mostly the same thing we've seen in other games, I feel like Concord is going to start feeling stale pretty quick unless they start adding more content soon. Maybe revising some things like character designs wouldn't hurt either. Stepping back from the story element a bit. I'm also worried a bit about the total player base. Hopefully this game manages to find some kind of niche because it is fun to play, but after the abysmal beta performance, I don't know how many people are going to be playing when the game actually comes out. It ain't free to play. It's going to be $40 at launch, and while there's no battle pass or in-game store or anything, which I do appreciate, I feel like a multiplayer shooter like this really needs to be free to keep a solid player base, especially with it not really being particularly standoutish in a lot of ways. It's a balanced game, and I think honestly that is becoming a little more of a commodity, not gonna lie, but the developers need to expand on it, add in new game modes and maps, stuff that you're not seeing elsewhere if the game is actually going to have long legs. But that's probably downstream of people buying the game, and you see a chicken and egg problem arise there. It has a lot working against it and some unnecessary elements that they could frankly do without, like anything to do with the story, for instance. But the core multiplayer experience is solid. It's fun. There are some entertaining powers, and I really like the old school map design. I'm just not sure anyone's going to still be playing in a month, which makes it hard to recommend. If you're really jonesing for a hero shooter, don't mind weird looking characters and want nothing to do with the other big hero shooters coming out, like Marvel Rivals or Deadlock, which, by the way, I am not averse to those games. I think this is one to give a shot. It's not a game I'm loving, but the more time I put into it, the more I appreciate what it's doing. And frankly, I think they just need to focus the experience more. Honestly, there's aspects I really do like, but for every one of those, there's something unnecessary that bogs it down. Not necessarily during matches even, but just around. Like I said, if they can redesign some characters and pull back on those story elements, I think they have something here, but they need more unique stuff in terms of modes, particularly in terms of modes. But that's what I think